Good evening. I've been looking forward to this for 5 days. Let's just go right ahead and start, and then I'll give you a recap of where we were from the previous week. This is the back end of chapter 11. Pip is at Miss Havisham's house, and let's just jump in. It is not much to the purpose whether a gate in that garden wall, which I had scrambled up to peep over on the last occasion, was, on that last occasion, open or shut. Enough that I saw no gate then, and that I saw one now. As it stood open, and as I knew that Estella had let the visitors out, for she had returned with the keys in her hand, I strolled into the garden and strolled all over it. It was quite a wilderness, and there were old melon frames and cucumber frames in it, which seemed in their decline to have produced a spontaneous growth of weak attempts at pieces of old hats and boots, with now and then a weedy offshoot into the likeness of a battered saucepan. Okay, so let me catch you up. We are at the back end of chapter 11, and Pip has returned to Miss Havisham's house. And the last time he was here, he met Miss Havisham. The clocks were all stuck at a particular time. He met Estella, who he found very pretty, but she was cruel and mean to him, and commented on his class origins in a way that made him ashamed. And now, in this chapter 11, he has returned, and we, on Thursday of last week, word for word, we rewrote one of the most iconic scenes when Pip goes into the room across the hall from Miss Havisham's dressing room, and he sees the feast, the wedding feast laid out, and it's been totally untouched, and it's covered in cobwebs and mold, and there's all sorts of beetles and spiders and mice everywhere, and it's harrowing, and it's a great, beautifully described scene. And also we see Miss Havisham be cruel to these sort of minor relations, hangers-on, who are perhaps hanging about in anticipation of picking up an inheritance, and are, they're just flatterers and fakes. Now, because it was a long chapter, I broke it in two. So all of that has ended, and Pip has sort of been released, like a dog is what he says, given some food and released into this decrepit estate to sort of explore at his will, it would seem. So that's where we are. It's the back end of chapter 11. I have to say that I've had, a long, busy, in a good way, stressful day, and I've been looking forward to this all day just as an opportunity to slow down, take control of my time, work at my own pace. So I'm really glad to be here and hope you enjoy this rewrite. And we're one paragraph in. We've got about 4.5 pages to go in this. 4.5 pages to go in this chapter. And then we will do chapter 12 as well. And I think I should probably raise my mic a bit. Hopefully that helps with audio. Let us continue. When I had exhausted the garden and a greenhouse, with nothing in it but a fallen down grapevine and some bottles, I found myself in the dismal corner upon which I had looked out of the window, never questioning for a moment that the house was now empty. I looked in at another window and found myself to my great surprise exchanging a broad stare with a pale young gentleman with red eyelids and light hair. So, the first time we came to Miss Havisham's house, we basically only met Miss Havisham and Estella. And it was a very eerie, cool experience. And I think this is a really good tip for us, which is, try not to overwhelm the reader. And so on this second occasion, Dickens has introduced so many more characters, like these minor relations. So if you're going to return to a particular setting, try and be judicious with the rhythm and release of the information, and bring characters in, sort of like at a rate at which the reader can absorb them. I'm also going to try in today's session to not always read as I write, but finish writing a paragraph and then read it back. So let me try that here. This pale young gentleman quickly disappeared and reappeared beside me. He had been at his books when I had found myself staring at him, and I now saw that he was inky. So immediately we know that this young boy is studying, and we know the challenges Pip has in the village school. So there's already a class difference. Hello being a general observation, which I had usually observed to be answered by itself. I said hello. I'm not halloa, politely omitting young fellow. Well, we know Pip is a polite young man. Who let you in? Said he. Miss Estella. Who gave you leave to prowl about? Miss Estella. Not technically true. Come and fight. This is sort of Dickens concentrating youth, right? In childhood, things can escalate out of nowhere, as we saw with Estella turning around and slapping Pip earlier in this chapter. "Come and fight," said the pale young gentleman. What could I do but follow him? I have often asked myself the question since. What else could I do? His manner was so final, and I was so astonished that I followed where he led, as if I had been under a spell. So, from time to time, we get this Pip in the future reflecting back on the moment, right? We've talked about it, sort of this using temporality to slow down the story at key points. It's a sign, I think, that the scene to come is important, or that the narrator thinks of it as important in his or her own trajectory. I think this is important for practitioners. Sometimes you want to mark things for readers to pay attention to pay special attention to. "Stop a minute, though," he said, wheeling round before we had gone many paces. "I ought to give you a reason for fighting." What a reasonable young man. There it is. In a most irritating manner, he instantly slapped his hands against one another, daintily flung one of his legs up behind him, pulled my hair, slapped his hands again, dipped his head, and butted it into my stomach. So he really gets the fight going in no time. The bull-like proceeding last mentioned, besides that it was unquestionably to be regarded in the light of a liberty, was particularly disagreeable just after bread and meat. I therefore hit out at him, and was going to hit out again, when he said, "Aha, would you?" and began dancing backwards and forwards in a manner quite unparalleled with my limited experience. "Laws of the game," said he. Here he skipped from his left leg onto his right. "Regular rules." Here he skipped from his right leg onto his left. "Come to the ground and go through the preliminaries." Quite a talker, this kid. Here he dodged backwards and forwards and did all sorts of things, while I looked helplessly at him. I was secretly afraid of him when I saw him so dexterous, but I felt morally and physically convinced that his light head of hair could have had no business in the pit of my stomach, and that I had a right to consider it irrelevant when so obtruded, great word, obtruded on my attention. Therefore, I followed him without a word to a retired nook of the garden, formed by the junction of two walls and screened by some rubbish. On his asking me if I was satisfied with the ground, and on my replying yes, he begged my leave to absent himself a moment, and quickly returned with a bottle of water and a sponge dipped in vinegar. What a strange little boy. Available for both, he said, placing these against the wall, and then fell to pulling off not only his jacket and waistcoat, but his shirt too, in a manner at once light-hearted, businesslike, and bloodthirsty. What a great series of incongruous adjectives: light-hearted, businesslike, and bloodthirsty. And because they're all made up of two words, there's a real musicality in addition to their incongruousness. So that's just good writing, right? Surprising, well imagined, full of life. Although he did not look very healthy, having pimples on his face, and a breaking out at his mouth. These dreadful preparations quite appalled me. I judged him to be about my own age, but he was much taller, and he had a way of spinning himself about that was full of appearance. For the rest, he was a young gentleman in a gray suit, when not denuded for battle. With his elbows, knees, wrists, and heels considerably in advance of the rest of him as to development. So really someone in the midst of an awkward puberty. My heart failed me when I saw him squaring at me with every demonstration of mechanical nicety and eyeing my anatomy as if he were minutely choosing his bone. So all of this pomp and circumstance, all of this like getting ready for battle, the vinegar, the taking off his clothes, the quippy little statements, like it really shows that this kid is like all bluster, all show. And I think in writing you always want to differentiate between seeming versus being. People seem one way but then turn out to be another way, and that's always fun. An enigma resolution for a reader is X seems one way but really they're another way. That's always a very simple thing that gets at the heart of what fiction is all about. as if he were minutely choosing his bone. I never have been so surprised in my life as I was when I let out the first blow and saw him lying on his back, looking up at me with a bloody nose and his face exceedingly foreshortened. But he was on his feet directly, and after sponging himself with a great show of dexterity, began squaring again. The second greatest surprise I have ever had in my life was seeing him on his back again, looking up at me out of a black eye. So Pip is just smashing this guy. His spirit inspired me with great respect. He seemed to have no strength, and he never once hit me hard, and he was always knocked down. But he would be up again in a moment. Sponging himself or drinking out of the water bottle, with the greatest satisfaction in seconding himself according to form. So he really likes doing things the way they're meant to be done, which is an interesting quality in a young man. And then came at me with an air and a show that made me believe he really was going to do for me. At last, he got heavily bruised, for I am sorry to record that the more I hit him, the harder I hit him. But he came up again and again and again, until at last he got a bad fall with the back of his head against the wall. Even after that crisis in our affairs, he got up and turned round and round confusedly, probably concussed, a few times, not knowing where I was, but finally went on his knees to his sponge and threw it up. At the same time panting out, "That means you have won." So even in defeat, this boy is very determined to do everything according to form and the proprieties and the niceties of formal combat. Very interesting. And Pip seems to have great admiration for him. He seemed so brave and innocent. That although I had not proposed the contest, I felt but a gloomy satisfaction in my victory. Uh, Indeed, I go so far as to hope that I regarded myself, while dressing, as a species of savage young wolf or other wild beast. However, I got dressed, darkly wiping my sanguinary face at intervals. And I said, "Can I help you? How polite is Pip?" And he said, "No, thank ye." And I said, "Good afternoon." And he said, "Same to you." So the fight, in classic children's fashion, seems to have brought them closer together. In general, characterization through contrast is one of the strongest ways to characterize. And so here we have Pip and this young man who is likely to play an important part in the book being contrasted through how they approach this fight. You know, the young man is all about showing and niceties and form, and Pip, despite being polite, soft-spoken, has a side to him, a depth of capability and ability that we see. When I got into the courtyard, I found Estella waiting with the keys. But she neither asked me where I had been, nor why I had kept her waiting. And there was a bright flush upon her face, as though something had happened to delight her. Well, my guess is she was somewhere in the house and was looking out of a window, right? Because we know she delights in cruelty and savagery, so she must have enjoyed watching the fight. Instead of going straight to the gate, she stepped back into the passage and beckoned me. "Come here. You may kiss me if you like." I kissed her cheek as she turned it to me. I think I would have gone through a great deal to kiss her cheek, but I felt that the kiss was given to the coarse common boy as a piece of money might have been, and that it was worth nothing. So we can see already Miss Havisham's training of Estella into being someone who uses her prettiness as a weapon is already at work. We see Pip is riven with shame. He wants to kiss her, and yet when he gets the kiss, because she's previously insulted him and shamed him, he feels that it was sort of like an insult, like, you know, the way she gives food to him like he's a dog. So it's getting very psychologically complex now. And I think this chapter 11, is absolutely iconic, not only because of, you know, Miss Havisham's house and the table with the cobwebs and the mice and the beetles, and Pip sort of dancing with Miss Havisham, or, you know, walking around the room in these great big circles. For those reasons, it's iconic. But then you just compress all the intensity of childhood into the back end, into the last 5 pages. I mean, already we had Estella in the same chapter, slap Pip and kiss Pip. And poor Pip, he's just a kid, and he's got all these adrenaline, endorphins, shame, everything running through his body. And here in these last 5 pages, he beats up a boy, and he gets a kiss from this girl, and it's so complicated. So you see, really, Dickens has set all the pieces up, and now he's creating these strong dynamics. What with the birthday visitors, and what with the cards, and what with the fight, my stay had lasted so long that when I neared home, the light on the spit of sand off the point on the marshes was gleaming against a black night sky, and Joe's furnace was flinging a path of fire across the road. So a beautiful image to end the chapter on, and an image of sort of fire in the night, and very evocative, especially given the intensity of feeling that Pip must be experiencing and internally. But I would also like to do chapter 12 today as well. So let's just, because it's a short one, and I think Pip is going to reflect on the events of chapter 11, which, as we talked about, were momentous. My mind grew very uneasy on the subject of the pale young gentleman. The more I thought of the fight, and recalled the pale young gentleman on his back in various stages of puffy and encrimsoned countenance, the more certain it appeared that something would be done to me. Pip really has this persecution complex, or I guess we should say paranoia. But, as a child, he did aid and abet an escaped convict. But he really feels that people are always out to get him. Is that Pip, or is that also just what it's like to be a young child? I remember always feeling like I was in trouble, often because I had done things where I was afraid people would discover what I had done, but also just that was a state of mind. The more certain it appeared that something would be done to me. I felt that the pale young gentleman's blood was on my head, and that the law would avenge it. Without having any definite idea of the penalties I had incurred, it was clear to me that village boys could not go stalking about the country, ravaging the houses of gentlefolks, and pitching into the studious youth of England. Without laying themselves open to severe punishment. For some days, I even kept close at home. and looked out at the kitchen door with the greatest caution and trepidation before going on an errand, lest the officers of the county jail should pounce upon me. The pale young gentleman's nose had stained my trousers, and I tried to wash out that evidence of my guilt in the dead of night. I had cut my knuckles against the pale young gentleman's teeth. Quite a savage fight, and I twisted my imagination into 1,000 tangles as I devised incredible ways of accounting for the damnatory circumstance when I should be hailed before the judges. So a long first paragraph that really, the language is very clear, giving us Pip's psychological state. Uneasy, twisted imagination in 1,000 tangles. We should never just assume that the reader understands our character's psychological state. You need to work and use language to make sure that they are somatically experiencing the psychological state that you are going for. When the day came round for my return to the scene of the deed of violence, my terrors reached their height. Whether myrmidons of justice, especially sent down from London, would be lying in ambush behind the gate, whether Miss Havisham, preferring to take personal vengeance, for an outrage done to her house, might rise in those grave clothes of hers, draw a pistol, and shoot me dead. Pip really has quite some violent fantasies, huh? Whether suborned boys, a numerous band of mercenaries, might be engaged to fall upon me in the brewery and cuff me until I was no more. It was high testimony to my confidence in the spirit of the young man, of the pale young gentleman, that I never imagined him an accessory to these retaliations. They always came into my mind as the acts of injudicious relatives of his, goaded on by the state of his visage, and an indignant sympathy with the family features. However, go to Miss Havisham's I must. And go I did. And behold, nothing came of the late struggle. It was not alluded to in any way, and no pale young gentleman was to be discovered on the premises. I found the same gate open, and I explored the garden and even looked in at the windows of the detached house. So he's really becoming familiar with Miss Havisham's house. But my view was suddenly stopped by the closed shutters within, and all was lifeless. Only in the corner where the combat had taken place could I detect any evidence of the young gentleman's existence. There were traces of his gore in that spot, and I covered them with garden mold from the eye of man. On the broad landing between Miss Havisham's own room and the other room in which the long table was laid out, I saw a garden chair. A light chair on wheels that you pushed from behind. It had been placed there since my last visit, and I entered that same day on a regular occupation of pushing Miss Havisham in this chair when she was tired of walking, with her hand upon my presuming shoulder. So Pip starts to basically wheel Miss Havisham around. And we can see the narrative moving from scene, something happening in real time, into habitual action. You know, I entered the regular occupation of pushing Miss Havisham in this chair. Pip is now entering the rhythm and life of this home or this estate, and it's entering habitual action. Round her own room and across the landing and round the other room. Over and over and over again. Over and over and over again. We would make these journeys. And sometimes they would last as long as 3 hours at a stretch. I insensibly fall into a general mention of these journeys as numerous, because it was once settled that I should return every alternate day at noon for these purposes. and because I am now going to sum up a period of at least 8 or 10 months. So Dickens himself sort of, or through the narrator Pip, sort of self-consciously is informing the intended reader that I'm going to be doing some summary work. This is a useful, it's useful to see how someone as masterful as Dickens goes about doing summary, because summary is something that seems easy, but there's a lot of ways you can do it poorly. As we began to be more used to one another, Miss Havisham talked more to me and asked me such questions as what had I learnt and what was I going to be. I told her I was going to be apprenticed to Joe. I believed, and I enlarged upon my knowing nothing and wanting to know everything. In the hope that she might offer some help towards that desirable end. But she did not. On the contrary, she seemed to prefer my being ignorant. Neither did she ever give me any money. Or anything but my daily dinner, nor ever stipulate that I should be paid for my services. Estella was always about, and always let me in and out, but never told me I might kiss her again. Sometimes she would coldly tolerate me. Sometimes she would condescend to me. Sometimes she would be quite familiar with me. Sometimes she would tell me energetically that she hated me. Just a girl who can be so many things at once. For a young boy, you can see how thrilling and exciting that is. Like, you never know what you're going to get, and how stimulating and exciting that must have been for Pip. Miss Havisham would often ask me in a whisper, or when we were alone, "Does she grow prettier and prettier, Pip?" And when I said yes, for indeed she did, would seem to enjoy it greedily. There's something really vicarious and consumptive about Miss Havisham's interest in Estella. Also, when we played at cards, Miss Havisham would look on with a miserly relish of Estella's moods, whatever they were. And sometimes, when her moods were so many and so contradictory of one another, that I was puzzled what to say or do. Miss Havisham would embrace her with lavish fondness, murmuring something in her ear that sounded like, "Break their hearts, my pride and hope. Break their hearts and have no mercy." So we really see, Miss Havisham, who's had her heart broken, was left on the altar before her wedding and has been stuck in that frozen state ever since, has taken it upon herself to mentor Estella into being a heartbreaker. And it's so simple, fascinating, complicated, fascinating, but poor Pip, because he's just a kid, and you can see the train heading towards him in the form of Estella. There was a song Joe used to hum fragments of at the forge. Of which the burden was Old Clem. I'm going to just type up this whole paragraph and then read it. There was a song Joe used to hum fragments of at the forge, of which the burden was Old Clem. This was not a very ceremonious way of rendering homage to a patron saint, but I believe Old Clem stood in that relation towards smiths. It was a song that imitated the measure of beating upon iron, and was a mere lyrical excuse for the introduction of Old Clem's respected name. Thus you were to hammer boys round Old Clem, with a thump and a sound Old Clem. Beat it out, Old Clem, with a clink for the stout Old Clem. Blow the fire, Old Clem. Roaring drier, soaring higher, Old Clem. So it's sort of a song for blacksmiths, and it's an extended digression, and we wonder where's Dickens going with this? Also, I wonder, did Dickens know this about blacksmiths at the time? Did he do, character research into blacksmiths when he built Joe? And also, it's interesting because smithing, except as a very niche hobby, is basically over. And you wonder what all sorts of interesting things like this have been lost as we've gone towards factories and automation. One day, soon after the appearance of the chair, Miss Havisham suddenly saying to me, with the impatient movement of her fingers, "There, there, there. Sing." I was surprised into crooning this ditty as I pushed her over the floor. It happened so to catch her fancy that she took it up in a low, brooding voice, as if she were singing in her sleep. After that, it became customary with us to have it as we moved about, and Estella would often join in. Though the whole strain was so subdued, even when there were three of us, that it made less noise in the grim old house, than the lightest breath of wind. I think this is just like something well imagined and interesting and weird and incongruous. And Dickens is so good at creating that. And it's a really good paragraph because it shows the weird codependency and strange dynamic that is forming between Miss Havisham, Estella, and Pip. What could I become with these surroundings? How could my character fail to be influenced by them? Is it to be wondered at if my thoughts were dazed, as my eyes were, when I came out into the natural light from the misty yellow rooms? I mean, every time he emerges from this house, he's emerging from an alternate world, from a portal into a weird world. It's like Alice repeatedly coming out of the rabbit hole. Perhaps I might have told Joe about the pale young gentleman if I had not previously been betrayed into those enormous inventions to which I had confessed. Under the circumstances, I felt that Joe could hardly fail to discern in the pale young gentleman an appropriate passenger to be put into the black velvet coach. So just to catch up people or remind people, previously Pip had lied to Joe and Mrs. Joe, his sister, when he returned, lied about all sorts of stuff in Miss Havisham's house because it was almost too weird to explain, right? So instead he went to invention. And then he told Joe about his lies. Now he is afraid to tell Joe about the truth, which is, he met this young man, they had a fight, he beat him up, because he is worried that Joe would think he's lying or embellishing. This is, again, very Dickens really understanding childhood well and how a child's mind works, because that sort of logic is very accurate, I think. Therefore, I said nothing of him. Besides, that shrinking from having Miss Havisham and Estella discussed, which had come upon me in the beginning, grew much more potent as time went on. I reposed complete confidence in no one but Biddy. Biddy is the girl at the schoolhouse who's helping him. But I told poor Biddy everything. Why it came natural to me to do so, and why Biddy had a deep concern in everything I told her. I did not know then, though I think I know now. So again, we see Dickens doing that little trick, referring to the temporality. Pip in the present, the narrator, looking into the past, which tells us this is not a throwaway line. This is something to pay attention to. Why is he telling all this to Biddy? Why does she care? I think you can guess. Likely, just as he has feelings for Estella, Biddy has feelings for him. Meanwhile, councils went on in the kitchen at home, fraught with almost insupportable aggravation to my exasperated spirit. That ass, Pumblechook, used often to come over of a night for the purpose of discussing my prospects with my sister. And I really do believe, to this hour, with less penitence than I ought to feel, that if these hands could have taken a linchpin out of his chase cart, they would have done it. So attack a man where it hurts. Pumblechook's identity is tied to this chase cart, so Pip in his fantasies imagines destroying it. That's the depth of an imagining. The miserable man was a man of that confined stolidity of mind. That he could not discuss my prospects without having me before him, as it were, to operate upon. And he would drag me up from my stool, usually by the collar, where I was quiet in a corner, and putting me before the fire as if I were going to be cooked, would begin by saying, "Now, Mum, here is this boy. Here is this boy which you brought up by hand. Hold up your head, boy, and be forever grateful unto them which so did do. Now, Mum, with respections to this boy, and then he would rumple my hair the wrong way, which from my earliest remembrance has already hinted, I have in my soul denied the right of any fellow creature to do. You poor Pip, as a child, we have limited agency and it's hard to protect our personal space. And you see, Pip has a strong sense of integrity and personal space. It's part of what makes him such an appealing narrator. And would hold me before him by the sleeve. A spectacle of imbecility, only to be equaled by himself. As the book has gone on, Pip's distaste for Pumblechook has gotten more and more explicit. That is a sign of him coming into his own sense of self. Then he and my sister would pair off in such nonsensical speculations about Miss Havisham and about what she would do with me and for me, that I used to want, quite painfully, to burst into spiteful tears, fly at Pumblechook, and pummel him all over. In these dialogues, my sister spoke to me as if she were morally wrenching one of my teeth out at every reference, while Pumblechook himself, self-constituted my patron, would sit supervising me with a depreciatory eye, like the architect of my fortunes, who thought himself engaged on a very remunerative job. So I think one thing I'm noticing in this section is, in chapter 11 or in Miss Havisham's house, a lot of it is just the proeretic code, the code of praxis, the code of action, just what is happening. No images, no similes, metaphors, no comparisons. Here we're getting a lot of similes, metaphors, and comparisons that are humorous and funny, and it's comic relief, but it's showing also just the psychological state at home. So I'm not sure yet. I don't want to quickly say this is what this is doing and this is what that is doing. Let's just notice it, park it, and see if we can observe it further. In these discussions, Joe bore no part, but he was often talked at while they were in progress, by reason of Mrs. Joe's perceiving that he was not favorable to my being taken from the forge. I was fully old enough now to be apprenticed to Joe, and when Joe sat with the poker on his knees, thoughtfully raking out the ashes between the lower bars, my sister would so distinctly construe that innocent action into opposition on his part, that she would dive at him, take the poker out of his hands, shake him, and put it away. It's a really great long sentence, I think sometimes, um, of course, I love short sentences, but this is a great long sentence with lots of action, lots of strong verbs, and it's a beautiful sequence of actions. So, really, just shows how Joe is constantly being poked at. It's not a coincidence that there's a poker there. There was a most irritating end to every one of these debates. All in a moment, with nothing to lead up to it, my sister would stop herself in a yawn, and catching sight of me, as it were, incidentally, would swoop upon me with, "Come, there's enough of you. You get along to bed. You given trouble enough for one night, I hope." Poor Pip. As if I had besought them with a favor, besought them as a favor to bother my life out. So we see all these people, Pip has no agency, and they are planning his life out for him. Now we know the title of the book is Great Expectations, and we know this is a coming-of-age novel, so we can guess that their expectations for Pip's life are not going to materialize, and that Pip does have a hand in his own destiny. But for that to really give us maximum catharsis, we have to see him being poked and pinched and prodded and pushed around. We went on in this way for a long time, and it seemed likely that we should continue to go on this way for a long time. When one day Miss Havisham stopped short as she and I were walking, she leaning on my shoulder, and said with some displeasure, "You are growing tall, Pip." I thought it best to hint, through the medium of a meditative look, that this might be occasioned by circumstances over which I had no control. So here we literally see Dickens sort of explicitly making the joke that Pip is constantly being nagged about things outside his control. He has no agency at this point in his life. She said no more at the time, but she presently stopped and looked at me again. And presently again. And after that, looked frowning and moody. On the next day of my attendance, when our usual exercise was over, and I had landed her at her dressing table, she stayed me with a movement of her impatient fingers. This is again, you want to give your characters who are important some sort of talismanic qualities so they can become heuristic or cognitive shorthand, and her impatient fingers have become that. "Tell me the name again of that blacksmith of yours." Joe Gargery, ma'am. Meaning the master you were to be apprenticed to. Yes, Miss Havisham. You had better be apprenticed at once. Would Gargery come here with you and bring your indentures, do you think? I'm not 100% sure what this means. Let's hope context clarifies. You had better be apprenticed at once. Would Gargery come here with you and bring your indentures, do you think? I signified that I had no doubt that he would take it as an honor to be asked. Then let him come. At any particular time, Miss Havisham? Maybe there's some sort of formality that she is offering to oversee for Pip to be apprenticed or indentured to Joe. So we'll see. When I got home at night and delivered this message for Joe, my sister went on the rampage in a more alarming degree than at any previous period. She asked me and Joe whether we supposed she was doormats under our feet, and how we dared to use her so, and what company we graciously thought she was fit for. When she had exhausted a torrent of such inquiries, she threw a candlestick at Joe, burst into a loud sobbing, got out the dustpan, which was always a very bad sign, put on her coarse apron, and began cleaning up to a terrible extent. So again, we see a very long sentence for Mrs. Joe, and it's becoming a bit of a signature, and I think it shows her frenetic action, how she's just this tidal wave of action, and Dickens has, very consciously and deliberately attached this sort of signature long series of actions to her. Not satisfied with the dry cleaning, she took to a pail and scrubbing brush and cleaned us out of house and home. If you've ever been on the end of an aggressive house cleaning, you understand this. So that we stood shivering in the backyard. It was 10 o'clock at night before we ventured to creep in again. And then she asked Joe why he hadn't married a slave at once. Joe offered no answer, poor fellow, but stood feeling his whisker and looking dejectedly at me, as if he thought it really might have been a better speculation. So we can deduce what has happened here, right? Because we know that Miss Havisham was very alert to her relatives flattering her, trying to get money or favors or part of the estate. And she has figured out that, hey, you were supposed to be apprenticed to the blacksmith, but why hasn't that happened yet? You're getting taller. It's about that time. She's probably figured out that Pumblechook and Mrs. Joe are doing exactly what they're doing, thinking that if Pip lingers around Miss Havisham's house, she will give him money or do something to set him up for the future. And Miss Havisham clearly hates people taking advantage of her. So she gets ahead of this very quickly by saying, hey, I'll help you out with the formalities and get you apprenticed. As it happens, Pip and Joe, Joe really likes Pip, and I'm sure for many, many years has had imagined them working together and seen it as a potential pleasurable future. But his wife kind of runs the show, and she's calling the shots. And but here, Miss Havisham, out of her intense sensitivity to being taken advantage of, has outfoxed Pumblechook and Mrs. Joe and sent Mrs. Joe onto a rampage. So I think in this chapter, we really are starting to see, in those early chapters, Dickens is putting all the pieces on the board and putting them into certain dynamics. But now he's turning the temperature up and moving the pieces and changing the dynamics. And so really, when you think of your beginning, middle, and end, that's something to think about as the beginning, as setting the tone, of course, getting crucial exposition, and also putting your pieces into place and distinguishing who is who, what are their yearnings, what are their characters, and then putting those into flux in the middle. So we're very much in the middle now. Miss Havisham and Mrs. Joe are using Pip as a proxy for their own agendas, and poor Pip is caught in the middle. But I'm confident. I have confidence in our narrator. Well, that's the end of chapter 11 and the entirety of chapter 12. A short chapter, lots of interesting craft notes, lots of beautiful writing. Estella is just a fascinating character, and you feel for Pip. Like, he has pretty much no chance but to be enamored with her. But yeah, really fun. I was looking forward to this for 5 days. I'm so glad it's happened. I mean, it's amazing. You sit in the chair and the energy just comes, and an hour and a half goes without even trying. So thank you for being part of this project. Day after tomorrow, we'll continue with chapter 13, and that's it. I don't know how to end these things. I should find a quippy way to end. But for now, good night.